Hi, I'm Meredith Hutchison-Hartley.
And I'm Emily Geddes.
And welcome back to the Hidden History of Business podcast. Today we're going to be discussing Nushu, which is a women's language found exclusively in China. But before we jump into that, I want to kind of explain how this episode's going to go, because to be honest, this was one of our most frustrating episodes to research. So for the first half, we're going to discuss what the generally accepted story of Nushu seems to be, and what we can learn from that. But then in the second, we're going to talk about some of the contradictions and inaccuracies and some of the murkiness that different motivations have brought into that accepted story, and what we can also learn from that. So Emily is going to start us off.
Nushu, as Meredith was saying, is a gender-specific language. It was exclusively used by women in Jiangyong County in Hunan, southern China. The beginnings are very ambiguous. We don't have a lot of information on when the language came into being. Women in feudal China were the least likely to be educated, to be literate. Many men and women both were illiterate during this time, but women in particular were denied education and denied the ability to read and write. However, they still wanted to be able to communicate. So at some point, somewhere between 900 and 1400 or so, this women's language developed, separate from men entirely. And it was used to communicate between women, in large part because marriage at this time was not considered a source of emotional connection. Marriage was exclusively for continuing the line of...
It was a business. It was a
Right.
It was a social contract. You were supposed to produce children and take care of your husband's home.
Yeah, marriage was a business arrangement. There was absolutely no expectation that your emotional needs would be met in the marriage relationship. So one of the innovations that came out of this to fill that need for emotional connection is that women were often sworn sisters to other women. And sometimes this happened in groups of sworn sisters, and occasionally it happened as a lao tong, which means old same, and was also a contractual agreement between two girls whose families matched them based on 8 different characteristics. And these two girls would grow up together. They would communicate with each other with this special Nushu language. They would continue to correspond with each other across distances after they both got married, and they would be these soulmates that would provide that emotional connection that women would not receive through their marriage. Now, Nushu was a phonetic language rather than the pictographs that the regular Chinese language is. It was a written language, but it was also sung. It was written in verse often.
So it wasn't just for communication. It sounds like they were also using it for artistic and spiritual expression.
Absolutely. It was used to communicate their feelings, to express their feelings that they were not able to do in other settings. It was written on fans. It was embroidered on handkerchiefs. In fact, I was first introduced to it through a book called Snowflower and the Secret Fan by the author Lisa C., who you may not know, she is actually 1/8 Chinese. Her great-grandfather was Fang Si, who was a 19th century entrepreneur in California, in LA, who actually, he married a white woman, which was not allowed by the laws of the time. Because they weren't able to get a marriage license, they went to a lawyer and arranged a contract marriage instead. So Lisa C. is his great-granddaughter, so she has quite an extensive family who is Chinese American at this point. So a lot of the themes in her writing are from her Chinese heritage. So she discovered this concept of Nushu and was fascinated by it and traveled to China and interviewed some of the women who were still using Nushu at the time, and wrote about it in this book, Snowflower and the Secret Fan. So there's this one paragraph in the book on page 24-25 that I'm going to read about it. The book is narrated by Lily, who was at the time of the book 80 years old, looking back on her childhood. And at the time of this paragraph, she is 7 years old. She says, "Back then, I had yet to see men's writing, so I had nothing to compare it with. But now I can say that men's writing is bold, with each character easily contained within a square, while our Nushu looks like mosquito legs or bird prints in dust. Unlike men's writing, a Nushu character does not represent a specific word. Rather, our characters are phonetic in nature. As a result, one character can represent every spoken word with that same sound. So while a character might make a sound that creates the words for pear, P-A-R-E, P-A-I-R, or P-E-A-R, context usually makes the meaning clear. Still, much care has to be taken to make sure we do not misinterpret meaning. Many women, like my mother and grandmother, never learned the writing, but they still know some of the songs and stories, many of which resonate with a ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum rhythm. Aunt instructed me on the special rules that govern Nushu. It can be used to write letters, songs, autobiographies, lessons on womanly duties, prayers to the goddess, and of course, popular stories. It can be written with brush and ink on paper or on a fan. It can be embroidered onto a handkerchief or woven into cloth. It can and should be sung before an audience of other women and girls, but it can also be something that is read and treasured alone. But the two most important rules are these. Men must never know that it exists, and men must not touch it in any form.
So if men were never allowed to know it existed and it was so secret for so long, how did we discover that it even existed?
Well, again, this is kind of where it gets a little murky. Lisa C. tells a story that one day in the 1960s, an old woman fainted in a rural Chinese train station. And as the police are going through her belongings, trying to identify her and find next of kin, they come across some papers with a script on them that they don't recognize. They assume it's a secret code, because this is the 1960s, the height of the Cultural Revolution, and they arrest the woman and detain her on suspicion of espionage. But eventually they realize that this isn't a code necessarily. It's this written language solely used for women, but it's kind of murky from there. Mm-hmm. We found some references to it starting to be studied in the 1950s and then halting with the Cultural Revolution and then being picked up again in about the 1980s. But it's really kind of hard to pin down exactly the timeline there. Now, what we do know is that the last person considered proficient in the writing system was a woman named Yang Huangyi, who lived in Jiangyang in Hunan, and she died September 20th, 2004, at approximately the age of 98. It's kind of hard to pin down exact ages for people in this place at that time. However, there were also several other people who knew the language enough to write in it and read it. It's really hard to say exactly. I mean, the language is disappearing. Absolutely. There aren't nearly as many people who can use it, in large part because women are educated now, because there isn't as much of a need for this secret way to communicate between women, because women are no longer socially isolated. They no longer have their feet bound. They have access to education and most parts of society. So the language is definitely disappearing, but it's hard to pin down exactly how many people are still able to use this text, how many people recognize it. There are still several elderly people in China who know many of the songs that we mentioned earlier in Nushu. The lesson that I see from Nushu is that there was this need. These women needed this connection. They did not have access to the language of men. They did not have access to social interaction that we do today. So they found a way to make those connections. They found a way to have those emotional needs met. And innovation and adaptation are absolutely the story of business. Mm-hmm. So while Nushu doesn't necessarily look like it has a major business application, this is absolutely a story of people innovating to fill a need that they have.
Especially when marriage was a business arrangement in large part, but that business arrangement wasn't meeting all of their needs. Even without financial resources and a lot of access to the rest of the world, they were able to find a way to do it.
Right. So we've already said it's a little murky, and here it's going to get even murkier.
Yeah.
Because in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a bit of a resurgence of interest in Nushu. So I mentioned the book by Lisa C., Snowflower and the Secret Fan. That came out in 2005, and it was actually made into a film in 2011, I believe. There was also a documentary made in 1999, a little bit earlier, and we'll link to a description of that on our website. But in 2005, we also tracked down the Ford Foundation issued a grant to several organizations in Hunan province for the specific purpose of preserving Nushu. The annual report in 2005 of the Ford Foundation indicates that it was a $206,000 grant to support the preservation of Nushu. 4 organizations, the Federation of Women's Organizations, the Provincial Agency for Cultural Affairs, the Jiangyang Prefectural Government, and Yongzhou City applied to the Federation for support, and the money was split among those 4 organizations. It was supposed to be used for the construction of a Nushu Ecology Museum and a Nushu Database Museum. They were going to repair and expand a Nushu garden founded by the prefectural government in Jiangyang. And then they were going to, Hunan University was going to digitize the original Nushu materials and then open them up to the public. Now, we haven't been able to find any information about those things actually happening.
I mean, there is the Nushu Garden has been expanded. There's now a language school. It's kind of like become a cultural complex. So we know that there is a school there where they seem to be teaching Nushu, but that's kind of murky. And we know that there is this garden with some monuments in it, but the status of the museum and the database are kind of
and even
shaky.
That stuff, what we found was several years old. There was also a Chinese composer, Tan Dun, created a multimedia symphony entitled Nushu, The Secret Songs of Women, which we haven't been able to track down a copy of, but I think would be fascinating. He went to Hunan province and spent 5 years conducting field research and filming women singing these songs. So there are obviously still women there who know these songs, who are able to sing them and pass them along. So there's a lot of, I think, missing information and stuff that's not necessarily adding up. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention that I found very interesting is that Nushu is in the Guinness Book of World Records.
It is.
It is. It is the most gender-specific language in the Guinness Book of World Records. There you go. So now, Meredith, you have more of a background in Asian studies and understanding that aspect of it. So can you talk a little bit more about some of the concerns about this recent resurgence in Nushu and how it's being used?
Yeah. As I was reading the articles, I saw a lot of contradictions. At first, you'll read an article that says that Nushu is on the verge of dying out and there's only 1 or 2 people left that speak it. And then you'll read another article from the next year that talks about how there are 3, 4, or 12, or 20 people who are still singing these songs and that old women still use it. And then you'll read an article that says these young women are suddenly interested in Nushu and are learning it again. Then suddenly you'll read one that says the last speaker has died out, and another article about how many people are speaking it. It's very, very confusing because you can't actually get a read on who's speaking it. Is it dead or is it not? And to understand why this is happening, you have to understand how the Chinese government exerts influence over the culture in China and has for decades. To understand that, we need to go back to the Cultural Revolution, which Emily discussed a little bit before. The short version of that is that in the 1960s, Mao Zedong was starting to lose control over the Chinese government. And in order to re-exert that control, he appealed to the youth of China to begin a purge of Chinese culture. Because he believed that communist leaders were going to take over the party in China itself and take it in the wrong direction, he wanted those youth to purge impure elements of Chinese society and kind of bring back that revolutionary spirit that had helped him win the Civil War so long before. Now, it continued in various phases from about the mid-1960s into the late 1970s when Mao Zedong died. But that culture of the Cultural Revolution, that belief has persisted because most of China's leaders today were youth during that time period. Now, when we say they wanted to purge elements of Chinese society that were impure, we're talking about that the modern Chinese government has advocated an idea that all those previous cultures within China, before Mao brought his great unifying culture, were inferior minority cultures. And their faults and their issues are obvious because they were from lesser societies. And this more pure Chinese society has done away with the need of those things. Nushu is a problem for them then because there's so much interest in it, but it is a relic of one of those previous impure subcultures. The best way that the Chinese government can control it is by showing why it is irrelevant. So if Nushu was a relic from a time when women's needs were not met, and Mao's government completely changed that so that women could be educated, could be out in society, then obviously Nushu is not necessary anymore, and it should die out. Because why would women still need it in the perfect society created by Mao. And if they do still need it, that is a threat to the ideology that government has tried to put forward. So there's that simply as a problematic issue. But then you also have the government's vested interest in tourism. Nushu is attracting a lot of attention from scholars and from tourists who want to come and see it. So they want to capitalize on that, which means first they have to take control of it. So Nushu is a dying language, according to them, which now they are taking money from other organizations so that they can control how it is disseminated from now on. They have built this language school in Hunan province where people are now coming, and it's actually kind of revitalizing the local economy. Girls who would have been forced into marriage in their late teens are now building careers by learning Nushu. We'll put linked articles on our site where these women are saying things like, I can make more money than my brother or my father now. I don't need to get married. I'm young yet. And this extremely economically depressed area of the province is suddenly having this revitalization that is completely centered on the women. Now, in order for them to learn that language, they have to go to this garden school. There's a woman there who her title is the official transmitter of the language. Well, who gave her that title? The government that runs and funds the school. So we've taken Nushu from being a subculture that the government really couldn't control or understand to being something that the government is now preserving as a historical curiosity and a cultural interest, but that isn't something that's necessary anymore. On top of that, they're really controlling the facts. A lot of researchers talk about how frustrating it is that even if they find something that may contradict what the established facts are, they can't publish it. Because if you contradict the government, you will no longer have access to these primary source materials that are completely controlled by the government now. And that's moved even further. Because it's an economic power, suddenly everyone's jumping on the bandwagon trying to get money out of it. So you have the women who are owning it, who are learning it, and commercializing it, which is a concern in and of itself, because when a culture starts being commercialized, you start changing it. You start adjusting songs or words. There are even some cases of local merchants making up Nushu words or symbols and printing them on things to sell to tourists. You have the problem of this composer who spent 5 years listening to these songs, but then took them and wrote his own, and is appropriating this women's culture to produce his own symphony, which is being, again, controlled by marketing and tourism, and financed with the government as well. And then you have local politicians jumping on it, because before, the money was coming in simply through the Chinese government. But now we have local provincial leaders who are saying, hey, our village, our town, qualifies for this government program, so I'm applying for money that my local area will control to develop infrastructure, to develop tourism. And you have developers from Hong Kong who are coming in and building roads and hotels and turning it into a tourist trap because it's a chance to make money, and people are willing to travel there and spend money to see this historical curiosity. Think Colonial Williamsburg or Jamestown or any of those other historical sites that people go for tourism purposes.
So there's this balance between the economic prosperity that it's bringing to the area, but also preserving the integrity of the historical accuracy and cultural significance of Nushu.
Part of the lesson there is where you have this amazing piece of history, but there's this tension between preserving something and commercializing it. What we're really seeing in Nushu, in this messy murkiness where we're so frustrated trying to figure out what the real story is what happens when a government's ideology, when financial interests, when local motives, when all those crash together, it obscures what the real story is. And as historians, we're kind of left struggling with that.
But when you get back to that original story, it is the story of innovation and adaptation and women disadvantaged by the society, isolated by the society, finding a way to meet their emotional and social relationship needs.
And we see these women doing that now. If there's one thing that stands out in all of these competing interests, is that we now see again the women of this province and of this village using everyone else's motives to do that for themselves with Nushu again. If any of you have more information about Nushu, we would love to hear from you. So go ahead and head over to our Facebook page or hit us up on Twitter at HiddenBiz. That's at HiddenBiz. And let us know. We'd love to talk with you some more.
This is Emily Geddes.
I'm Meredith Hartley, and thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, consider leaving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or social media. You can find snark, updates, and behind-the-scene peeks at production on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business. Music for this podcast is from the album Time Within Itself by Michael Waldrop and used with permission of the artist. You can find out more about it on iTunes and Amazon. If you'd like to access show notes and multimedia content and the periodic rant from your hosts, be sure to visit our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com.